I'm thrilled that we're joined by Caroline Lucas, Green MP, who's taken time out of her very busy schedule to be here, and also by John Hillary from War on Want and Nick Dearden from Global Justice Now. So thank you. In a moment I'm going to... The idea for Artists Against TTIP came about through a conversation between myself and my brother, John Cracknell, who's an environmental philanthropist, and we were talking about TTIP, and as soon as he started to describe it to me, the scale of this issue became apparent, and what was disturbing about it was that no one knew about it. So I would start talking to friends, to colleagues, to journalists, to senior playwrights, and people had never heard about TTIP. What's TTIP? What's this trade deal? What are you talking about? So the idea was really simple, to use the artistic community and the power that we have, our connections with the media, to talk about the issue, to get it out into the public sphere, and to empower then campaigners to be able to affect the kind of political change that they want to affect, because we can get it out there and we can get the issue widely understood. So the aim is to have conversations with visionary journalists who understand and want to kind of get on board with the campaign, to make artworks, whether it's short films, whether it's comedy pieces for TV, short stories, all sorts of things, in order to, in a way, create a storytelling revolution about TTIP. How do we make it clear? How do we make it understandable? How do we make it accessible? So that's the aim of today. We thought we would just draw together a brilliant group of people. There are some amazing people here today, so thank you, all of you, for joining us. And really use these expert brains to kind of brief us so we can move forward from this point. So thank you so much, and I'm going to hand over to John Hillary.
Felt is that people don't really know what's happening at this far-off, obscure trade deal. And most of our time over the past 18 months has been trying to package an incredibly complex set of negotiations into something intelligible. And now I've been given the opportunity/challenge of, in 3 minutes, giving you the really condensed version of what TTIP is. It's basically easiest to think of it as 3 main pillars. The first pillar of TTIP, these big EU-US negotiations, is about deregulation. If you think about business on both sides of the Atlantic, trading, investing, operating, trying to set up new operations, the thing they hate is having to follow rules. Whether that be high environmental rules, saying you can't build a factory here unless you commit to protecting the environment, or labour standards you have to apply by proper maternity rights, by holiday pay, which they don't even have in the States as a statutory right, or indeed food safety standards, which has been one of the big things brought up under the TTIP negotiations. In the European Union, we fought really hard to block the entrance of GMOs, genetically modified food, into our food chain. In the States, they're everywhere. 70% of all processed food in the supermarkets in the States contains GM ingredients. And what they're saying on the TTIP is, you, the European people, you don't get to choose. Free trade means we, big businesses, can do what we like. So deregulation is right at the centre of TTIP, and for us perhaps the scariest bit of it. What type of future do we want for next generations to come? Do we want a future which is just about maximising profit for big business? Or do we actually look to higher values, like environmental safety, like labour rights, like proper gender equality? All of the things that we've built up over decades and decades and decades and decades could be wiped out. So first scary pillar, deregulation. Second one, privatisation. A lot of you would have heard mention of the NHS, if you've heard about TTIP in this country. This real fear that all the privatisations we've already seen are a prelude to an even greater handover of power to the private sector. And we've seen, for example, under the coalition government in 2012, the NHS being opened up to private sector providers. So you now have Virgin providing frontline NHS services up and down the country. Well, if that goes into a trade deal like TTIP, it becomes effectively irreversible. The idea is that you're giving a guarantee to US corporations that they will have access to that market in perpetuity. So you don't get the democratic rights of realising you've made a mistake to an incoming government in the future which says we want to renationalise the rail, goodness gracious, or all the other things which are privatised. They can't do that because you get so hit by the penalties of reversing any privatisation in the future. And that's obviously a big political issue here in this country. So pillar 2, privatisation. Pillar 3 is the one which has got a lot of public outrage from people who hear about it. And that's this new special power where US corporations, for the first time, will be able to sue the UK government and all other European governments for introducing any public policies which restrict their profits. It's sort of unimaginable that this could happen. But this is the new power. It elevates those companies to the level of a nation state. It gives them their own privileged judicial system, one which we can't use, governments can't use, domestic companies can't use. It's just available for the US corporations to be able to sue us. And the UK government did an official study at the beginning of the negotiations in 2013. And they said, you know, what's that going to mean for Britain? And the LSE, London School of Economics, which did the study, came back and said, you can expect that US corporations will come in and hit the UK government time and time and time again for loss of profits. If, for example, you try and introduce plain packaging of cigarettes. This is what Australia did in 2012. Bam, they've been hit by Philip Morris for a multi-billion-dollar suit. And Philip Morris has said, if we get TTIP through, we will use exactly the same powers to come after the UK government, because they have now introduced the same thing. Canada introduces a ban on fracking under the St. Lawrence River. Before you know it, they're facing $250 million suit by a US company who said, we had plans. We were going to frack under the St. Lawrence River. You can't suddenly turn around and tell us we don't get to do that. You know, a couple of days ago, Lancashire County Councillor said the same thing. They don't get the right to do that if TTIP comes through. So that's a particular threat to democracy. You know, we surely, as sovereign people, have the right to choose whether we want GM, whether we want fracking, whether we want better terms and conditions at work, whether we want environmental standards and food safety for our kids in the future. That's really the big debate that TTIP is throwing up. There are other real threats. Even under the official estimates, we stand to lose at least 1 million jobs between the European Union and the US combined as a result. This isn't our figure, that's the official estimate done for the European Commission. Also in terms of environmental damage, the European Commission has said quite clearly this will lead to the loss of biodiversity, species extinction, and a massive increase in greenhouse gases at a time when I thought we were meant to be sort of cutting down on them. But all of these things are brought into play. You can talk for hours and hours and hours. I promised I would talk for 3 minutes only, which I think I've already exceeded. I'm really thrilled that everybody's here, and I think that the particular strength of what all of you can do is you can take this message out to a really, really broad audience through your networks, through your contacts, and also through the power of your voice. So I'm really, really thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for coming.
That you've just heard from John, you would imagine, I'm sure, that the politicians acting in your name would be up in arms. They would be fighting against this terrible threat to democracy. And I'm afraid I'm here to tell you that that isn't, by and large, the case. I mean, I think that what John has described essentially is the corporate takeover of democracy. What we're seeing is nothing less than a kind of slow-moving coup. And just because it's been mostly invisible till now doesn't mean to say that it isn't incredibly dangerous. And I think what the big challenge now is to try to get the message to politicians that people are finding out about this, even though it's being negotiated more or less behind closed doors in Brussels where nobody can get access to the key documents. It is very dangerous and people do care about it. And I think that the great thing that you would be able to bring to this campaign is just that sense of reach that the politicians can only dream of, the idea that you would be able to reach people that we struggle to. And also, frankly, politicians love anything to do with artists and so forth. So if you were able to come to Parliament and raise the issue in Parliament, I can guarantee that the MPs will be there, they'd be bothered to be there by their constituents, and it would be a marvellous way as well of just demonstrating that this cannot happen in secret, in private, that this has to have, you know, the spotlight absolutely shone on it because the implications are so huge. John has already said quite a bit about the implications. I was just going to add one more substantive thing before talking about process, and that was just simply to underline as well that the wider implications of whatever happens in this agreement, even though it's between the EU and the US, essentially developed countries, the impacts of what happens between essentially developed countries will go much, much wider. Poorer countries, the global south, are likely to have to meet whatever the new requirements are that have been sorted out without their say at all. So they have no say on what these new regulations will be. They are being done, as we know, behind the closed doors between the EU and the US. But nonetheless, it's quite possible that those standards then will become the global norm, and they will then be imposed upon some of these poorer countries to try to meet, and they've had absolutely no say over the process at all. I was just going to say a little bit about that process, and it is very appropriate that we are on the set of of Kafka's The Trial. It is a Kafkaesque world, and you're trying to understand, where does the buck stop? Where is transparency? How does this happen? Simply put, most trade policy in the EU is negotiated by people in Brussels, not by the UK government here. So we send our trade minister to talks in Brussels. He or she then meets with other trade ministers, and they essentially most of the time have most of the competence, in other words, most of the powers and the responsibility. We do have, as you know, an elected European Parliament, and I was a member of that European Parliament for 10 years. I was on the Trade Committee of the European Parliament for 10 years, and I might have thought, that as such I might just get to see some of these documents and, hell, who knows, even vote on them. But don't be so ridiculous, not a bit of it. Essentially on trade policy, the EU members of the European Parliament just most of the time have simply consultation rights. They don't have so-called co-decision rights. In other words, if they are lucky enough to get hold of the documents, they might be able to express an opinion on it, but very rarely does that opinion have legislative weight. In the European Parliament, I was actually known as the coordinator for the Green Group in Parliament, so that gave me a bit of extra status. So that meant that I could see some of the documents, but I had to sign something, literally in triplicate, to say that I would not share those documents with anyone. I mean, not other members of my political group, certainly not with NGOs or the public, God forbid. So I had to sign this thing in triplicate. One of the things I had to sign was to say that I would keep the said document that had confidential written all over it in a metal tin with a key. Now, I have to confess I never did have that metal tin with a key, and so it never was kept in that respect. But it's just ridiculous. You know, what kind of transparency is that? If one person from each political group, so that probably means 6 people in the whole of the European Parliament, are able to see some of the documents, and even then are not allowed to speak about what they have seen. I mean, I joke not, being on this set of Kafka is entirely appropriate. So there's a big democratic deficit at the European level, but there are also real issues at Westminster too, because it's a complicated issue. It may be, depending on exactly what the scope of TTIP finally covers, that there will be a vote in Parliament as well. But again, if there is a vote in Parliament, all that the Parliament will be able to do is essentially say yes or no. They won't be able to amend bits or suggest areas of difference. Essentially, it'll just be yes or no. There's a big job to be done just in terms of getting the spotlight on this issue, getting more and more people to know about it so they can demand more of their MPs to make sure that if there is an opportunity at Westminster, at the very least, we get the MPs voting the right way, that we put down parliamentary questions, that we keep pressing for greater transparency around all of this. The European Parliament is doing the best it can on this as well, and it's coming back to the European Parliament actually next week for another vote along the way. It's not a decisive vote from the corporate sector and from the government. That because we have managed to get, thanks to these guys and all of you, around 2 million people, I think now, who have signed a petition across Europe against TTIP, and I think there's over 300,000 people in Britain that have signed that petition. So because we are now getting a bit of a momentum behind this, there is a real kickback happening from the corporate sector and from government. Government keeps telling us that don't worry at all, it's all fine, you're all getting, you're all wrong, essentially. And they keep assuring us that anything important like the NHS or this nasty state dispute system that John was describing isn't really going to be very effective or threatening. The corporate sector is saying that without this we're going to lose jobs, whereas in fact the reality is that because of this we're going to lose jobs. So there's a real fight on our hands. Democracy is at stake. It's wonderful that you're hopefully on our side, because I think you'd be wonderful allies and we might just then be able to win.
So we've all been working on this for a little under 18 months probably, and when we started there was a lot of concern about how complicated this issue was, and there's so many acronyms, and can we ditch the acronyms and not call it TTIP and so on. But the thing that's really surprised me is how many people have just got it, because they know we're not actually talking about a trade agreement, we're talking about a corporate power grab, we're talking about democracy, and we're talking about power. And so in those 18 months, we've seen awareness go from, you could go and talk to virtually any journalist and any politician and they wouldn't know what you were talking about, and they think you were a crazed conspiracy theorist who'd made all of this up, to the stage where it strikes fear into the hearts of politicians in Brussels, in Westminster, in Berlin, in Washington. It's gained a level of traction that was completely unexpected. And there's an enormous buzz around it. There's an enormous amount of passion and anger, and we are just beginning to see that translated now into political action as well. So Caroline mentioned the vote in the European Parliament. It was about 3 weeks ago. We'd done a lot of work, but we hadn't expected to win it. There's a fairly big conservative, small c conservative majority in the European Parliament. We came so close that the heads of some of the political groups in the European Parliament pulled the vote a few hours before it was due to happen, because they'd lost control of their MEPs on this issue and they feared they were going to lose the vote on TTIP. That vote's now being, there's all sorts of compromises being stitched up, and that vote's going to happen next Wednesday. We do not know if we'll win it or not, but we have come so much further than we could have imagined that we would have come 18 months ago. President Obama, on the other side of the Atlantic, has been struggling for weeks and weeks now to get special authority so that he can call fast-track authority, so he can negotiate this without having to keep referring back to Congress. So he's in the same position that our European Parliament is in, essentially. And he just couldn't, I mean, the Democrats are almost unanimously opposed to Obama on this. He's had to do some really nasty deals with the Republicans. It's been like something from the House of Cards, basically. Frank Underwood hasn't slept for the last 3 weeks trying to get this through, and he finally got it through with the slimmest of majorities last week. So on both sides of the Atlantic, this isn't a Europe versus America thing. This really is a people versus elites and corporations issue. On both sides of the Atlantic, we've made so much headway in such a small amount of time. John and Caroline mentioned the European Citizens Initiative. I didn't even know what this was, but apparently under the Lisbon Treaty we have the right to formally petition the European Commission. And you need to get something like a million signatures in a year from lots of different countries, and then you get some time in the European Parliament and the Commission has to go and rethink about its position. So it's not a huge amount of power that it gives us, but it's something. So we said we want a European Citizens Initiative on TTIP. And the European Commission came back to us and said, oh no, you can't have it on TTIP. You're not allowed to do it on that. So we said, well, we're going to take you to court for that because we don't think that's right, and that court case is ongoing, but we're just going to do it anyway. So we set up this petition. It got 1 million signatures in about 2 months, so it was the fastest ever one of these citizens' initiatives to get to 1 million signatures. As Caroline said, it's now at 2.3 million across Europe, so it is now the biggest by a long way. One of these initiatives that's ever been undertaken. We're going to close it in October, which is a year after it started, and we really hope to get to 3 million by that stage, which would just send the most phenomenal message that this isn't just something that people don't understand. They really feel very strongly about this. And I want to say, a huge thank you to Carrie for putting this together today, because what we're starting today, I feel, is the next level of the campaign. We've done some great stuff, but we've never had as many photographers in one place as we did out on the balcony before. So by you guys coming in and helping with this campaign, it takes it to the mainstream. Activists and campaigners are already excited about this, but it still needs to permeate out much wider, in a way that it already has begun to do in Germany, because in Germany it has been far more associated with actors and artists, and it's been on TV way more, and it really is a national issue that cannot be ignored by anybody. And I think with your help, we can do that in this country too. So, as much as you feel able to do after we've gone through the questions and you've decided how you feel about it, from even just putting something out on Twitter and making a statement, to doing some press interviews, to dropping it into interviews that you already do, we'd be really, really happy to work with you to make sure that you feel confident enough to talk about it in any way that you would like us to, because we're all really conscious, as Caroline said, that you reach audiences that we can only really dream of reaching. I just want to finish up my not 3 minutes by saying, we always say when we're running campaigns, yeah, we can win this. We don't necessarily believe it. On this campaign, I really believe we can win it. It's one of the most exciting campaigns I've ever been involved in. And we have won stuff like this before. If you go back to the mid-90s, a very similar trade agreement was on the table, and we beat it within a year when people started knowing about it. It had very similar provisions to TTIP, some of the stuff John was talking about. Big business has tried to push this agenda through the World Trade Organization for years and years and years. We stopped it dead in its tracks. The World Trade Organization was unable to come to any agreement. And this is a very similar issue, in just the way that we stopped those things, in just the way that we got some relief for countries suffering from third world debt in the 1990s and 2000s, in just the way that we challenged the pharmaceutical industry to make AIDS medications more available to people who needed them across the world. I think TTIP is an issue on this scale. And by exposing TTIP, we don't just stop a trade deal we don't want, we expose some of the really deep injustices and inequalities in our society. And by defeating TTIP, we empower people in our society who often aren't apathetic, but just simply don't know what they can do and don't know how to do things. I think this would totally change the way that people thought about politics related to their society and engaged in democracy. And if people think they can change things, then there's no end to what's possible. So I really hope that you'll stay with us and begin to really begin changing and shaking up politics in Europe.
Two questions. First thing, who wrote this terrible legislation and why? I mean, I know why, but who made the writing? John, the 1 million job losses that you mentioned in the EU, where do they come from? And lastly, on the point of renationalisation being impossible, present company accepted no political party supports the renationalisation of the railways or the energy companies, and it's sold to us as dangerous Trotskyist agitation. Every poll for the last 5 years has suggested that 2/3 of the population are in favour. So this is mainstream interest. Don't let this be sold to us as minority agitation. Most people want this, and this would make it possible. Thank you.
In terms of where it came from, one of the myths that they put out was that somehow TTIP was going to give us the boost to respond to the economic crisis which came in from 2008 onwards. That's not true. To see where it really came from, you have to go back to the 1990s. In 1995, they formed this group called the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, which brought together the top chief executives from big business groups in Europe and the US. So they formed this group with a specific desire to see this type of agreement come into reality. And as Nick said, they tried it first through the multilateral agreement on investment, which we defeated. They then tried it through the WTO, and we stopped them. And this is the third time that this bad penny has come rolling back to us. So it has a very clear genesis like that. And when the European Commission was putting together its sense of what they wanted to get out of it, they had 119 secret meetings with the business lobbyists. We only found out about this later through the Freedom of Information Challenge. 119 meetings where they say to the business lobbies, what do you want it to say? What do you want in it? And then they come to us and they say, what do you think about that? As if it's a sort of consultation. We say, well, you've just taken it as a dictation from them. It doesn't matter what we think it's rubbish. And they say, yeah, but you're not actually doing the trading and investing, are you? So those are the people they've got to write it for them. In terms of the 1 million job losses, that's between the EU and the US combined. The way it breaks down, according to their figures, is 680,000 jobs will be lost in Europe and 325,000 in the USA. And that's a minimum. If they get the high, ambitious TTIP, which they really want, it would double that. The reason it happens is because when you have these trade deals, it's not just like we lose one job here and the others will get it there. Take agriculture, which is one of the areas they've identified which is going to be most badly hit. And that's why the farmers' groups in Ireland, for example, are absolutely up in arms about this. If you have small-scale farming, beef farming, for example, the sort of thing you see on Country File, if you watch Country File, you're very hip people, so you will be watching Country File. The nice sort of cows wandering around in green fields and these things. Think over to the United States, where you have these massive feedlots, these industrial agriculture production, 15,000, 20,000 cows locked in vices and being fed on a conveyor belt with grain. And that is what will take over from all of the family farming across Europe. So basically, all of the the Irish farmers, also the National Farming Union here in the UK, and lots of farmers groups, France, Spain, Italy, Poland, have just said, this is it. That is the end for us. We will lose all of our livelihoods and all the jobs, and it will go to these highly mechanised, capital-intensive, so no people, just machines, operations in the States. There's lots of other ways in which it happens. It's not just one way. European businesses want to open up the US market because at the local level in the USA, lots of states and counties have Buy American or Buy Local provisions, which are specifically set up to protect local jobs or to protect family firms or small businesses. And the big business sector over here is saying, no, that's a massive market. $650 billion a year market. It's huge, and we're not allowed into it. So the European businesses are saying, let's knock that out, even though that will see a massive loss of US jobs.
Just a word on the sort of corporate capture of Brussels in a sense, because it's not just that the NGOs or civil society aren't let into the secret about what's being cooked up by some of the civil servants in the Commission, for example. I mean, as elected MEPs, we were also the last to know. So again, through asking some of these questions, we discover that all kinds of dialogue has been going on between the corporations and some of the people in the Commission, in other words, the unelected civil servants, around the shape of agreements to come on everything, more or less. And actually the MEPs are really downstream of the process by the time we get to know about some of this stuff. And you know, when I've requested being at some of these meetings further upstream, the answer was fairly unequivocal and was a no. And I think just to widen it out more broadly, just for a moment, there's the corporate control of Brussels, and where so many of the corporations now have lobbying firms acting on their behalf in Brussels. It's a mega bucks industry, or euros industry, I should say, in Brussels, with huge amounts of lobbying going on there. And in here at Westminster, you know, we've kind of done it in a rather more genteel way. So instead of actually bothering all of that lobbying, what we do is just allow companies to second their staff straight into Whitehall. So cut out the middle person, don't bother lobbying, just get these people inside, for example, in the Department of Energy and Climate Change, DEC, the number of energy company firms who've got their own staff inside DEC writing the policy, and then you kind of wonder why it's all in favour of nuclear and fossil fuels rather than renewables or anything else. So that's one point I wanted to make. The second thing, when you were just talking about the railways, I just wanted to have a plug that on Monday I put down a private member's bill, again, to bring railways back into public ownership. But the serious point about it was that I do think that the Labour leadership debate offers us an opportunity here. Because although you're right, the Labour, sort of official policy is not in favour of renationalising the railways, they do know there's a lot of pressure on this, and they did get as far as saying that if they had been in power, they wouldn't have put the East Coast Main Line into private hands, they would have kept it public. And I think the more we can sort of develop a bit of a debate around some of that stuff, even now while there's a bit of a focus on the different leadership candidates, it's an opportunity to get them to talk about TTIP, it's an opportunity for them to talk about what they care about, some of these bigger issues too. And if we could make it a bit of a leadership issue, it would be a good way, I think, of getting some more kind of popular spotlight on it.
Caroline, what you just said there about the amount of lobbying that goes on in Brussels, there's a part to TTIP that the European Commission is pushing for, which would almost constitutionally enshrine the right of big business to lobby ahead of proposals being seen by Parliament, something called the Regulatory Cooperation Council, which they're very hot on pushing, which is actually in there in TTIP and would force regulators to think about everything as if they've got kind of TTIP glasses on. So everything is looked at through the lens of free trade, essentially, not public welfare, not the environment, not environmental protection, not public health, etc., etc. And there's just a couple of really nice anecdotes that show how far business has influenced the papers that have been written as part of TTIP. One is from a group called the City UK. I don't know if people know it, but it's a lobby group here in London for almost all the high street banks, investment banks and some hedge funds. And they have a little thing that was up on their blog, and it said, "We're so happy with the European Commission's take on, perspective on the TTIP negotiations. It could have come out of one of our handbooks." So that's nice of them. And then American agribusiness, which is another very big player in pushing for this, has repeatedly gone on record and said, you Europeans, you just need to get real about the food you eat, because millions of Americans eat this food and they're fine. So, and the people in the Commission tell us, well, don't worry, we're not going to let that happen. And you think, well, I don't know, maybe the people in the Commission are very well intentioned. Caroline can tell us whether they are or not. But even if they are, they're going to have to give something as part of these negotiations. If they want to get their businesses into local authority procurement, if they want to get the banking sector more rights in the United States, they're going to have to give something. And that's why these negotiations are happening in secret, because they say you can't hold this kind of negotiation in the public gaze. So nothing's certain, and you'll be told all these assurances from politicians at Brussels level and Washington level, but they can't promise anything because they're involved in the negotiation.
But two things I don't understand. So I'm glad to say that about stupid questions. Okay. Firstly, why would any government in the European Union, whatever its political colour, agree to this the ISDS is this part of TTIP which is about which allows corporations to sue government? I mean, why would any government, even the present one that we have here, be in favour of that? I don't understand why. So that's my first question. And my second question is, can you just explain how does this thing have to become law? Does TTIP have to become law? In other words, does it have to get voted for in European Parliament and our Parliament, or neither, or both? Or how does a treaty become ratified as such, and who gets to vote? So those are
I'll do the first bit of the process and you can correct me. The issue about the process is that it is so unclear that I've been trying to ask these questions, even of ministers, and the ministers themselves are kind of not entirely sure, because it depends how broad in scope TTIP finally is. If it is as broad as we think it will be and brings in issues like transport that are not formally EU competences, then it will have to have the agreement of the European institutions and each and every member state. So those are two separate decision points, if you like, or in fact they're more than that, because each and every member state will be making their own decision in their own time. So this can take several years to have it signed off in each parliament of all of the member states, as well as having an affirmatory yes, nod of a yes in the European Parliament. So there will be moments for lobbying. The difficulties, I understand it at the moment, is being able to predict exactly when that's going to be, but maybe John will...
And it's, yeah, I mean, some trade agreements don't have to come to national parliaments because they're not what's called mixed competency. We're almost sure that TTIP will be mixed competency, although it's not been officially said yet. I think there's some really shocking things that TTIP's exposed that I didn't know before. One of them is the European Parliament will get to say yes or no on this, but nothing else. It has no right, our elected politicians have no right to amend this treaty. We won't even see the text until it's been signed by the negotiators in the Commission, who are not elected. So that's really shocking that our European elected representatives can only say yes or no at the end of the day to this treaty. The second thing is, before it comes to the national parliaments, there is the possibility that it can already take effect. So it can take effect before our national parliaments voted on it, and then our national parliament can say no and it all stops. But that means that the ISDS under the ISDS mechanism, certain corporations can already sue Britain before our parliaments voted on it. In fact, there was a case recently where Russia was sued under one of these mechanisms for $50 billion. $50 billion. The Russian parliament has never ratified this treaty. So there's some really shocking aspects of how these things that don't just cover... I mean, the thing is, traditionally, trade agreements are about, well, you trade off this tariff against this tariff. There's an argument that can be made for you have to have those negotiations in a relatively small room, and it's fine. But we're talking here about massive aspects of public policy that are being traded off against one another, that could come into effect and affect us before our national parliament has even had a vote on this. Why is that the case? I think it's the case that it's because these are regarded as akin to treaties, so they're executive competence as opposed to legislative competence. And indeed, if we hadn't made such a fuss, it would be possible that this could simply go to Parliament, as trade agreements have before, sit on a table, wait for someone to object, and if nobody objects, it just goes through without even a discussion in Parliament. So, I mean, the thing about TTIP is it's not just TTIP, it exposes the whole way that international global economics has no connection with democracy at all. And I think that's also one of the, it makes you angry, but it's also one of the exciting things about working on it, because this has been going on for a long time. And the fact that we can use TTIP because people are concerned about it to expose more generally how our democracy is faulty.
So when you just on this one, when you say that the wording is created, it's written, and the text of this treaty is written by commissioners who've not been democratically elected, and MEPs can only say yes or no. Does that mean they can't introduce amendments? Or
That's right. It means exactly that. And so the chances are that if people are just given it to take it or leave it, they're more likely to kind of say, well, we better let it go. And so it's quite a clever way of fast-tracking it in a sense, rather than having to go through the laborious democratic process of discussing amendments.
And so it has to also go to the council, but even the council can't. So that's all the national governments. They can't make amendments either. There is one government on the Council of Ministers so far who have said they will veto TTIP, and that's the Greek government. So they're still there at the time.
Maybe I had a question, about politics.
Just on the first question of why any government in their right mind or not in their right mind would sign up to all of this. We put that question to Vince Cable, if you remember Vince Cable, the long-departed guy who was in charge of the Department of Business and therefore responsible for selling TTIP to the British people. I said, look, putting aside all of our differences, what possible reason could we have as a people to sign up to this? And his answer was, if it's good for business, it's good for everybody. And we just said, what, really? And that's the depth of that understanding. And I think what Caroline says about the whole idea of getting it through by making it sort of part of this bigger question. Are you pro-trade or are you against trade? We had a very unedifying spat with another of the Labour politicians against this, you're just pro-North Korea. So I thought, come on kids, we can do better than that. And he wasn't elected again. So that's it. But you know, that's the level of debate it can come down to. But on the ISDS side, it's even more clear. When the LSE did the study for the UK government on this, saying what will happen if these corporate courts come into being, and the LSE said on a cost-benefit analysis, there are no benefits, quote unquote, there are no benefits, but there will be big costs. I said that to Vince Cable. Don't you think that's a bit of a compelling argument for not having it? And he said, well, yeah, I do see your point. Literally.
But how do they square that with this endless argument coming from the Conservative government about parliamentary sovereignty? All the arguments for, repealing the Human Rights Act, which is all about getting control back of our own, rights and stuff. How do they square that with the loss of sovereignty that would be implied by something like the pantechnicon that would be TTIP, robbing us all of any say in huge amounts of stuff that affects savings? How do they square those two things?
They simply can't, and they've been going on down this track for a long time because the World Trade Organization, again, is an organisation that absolutely undermines, in many senses, the democracy of individual members of the WTO. And it is an incredible irony that the same governments that will stand up and defend the WTO to the hilt will absolutely run a mile from the EU on the grounds of that somehow, an undermining of our sovereignty. So there is no consistency, and they don't try and pretend that there is.
Can you talk a little bit about the sort of long-term intentions of perhaps of sort of freezing the neoliberal political and dispute mechanism now? It sort of reminds me of stabilisation clauses and things we've done before where, if it's correct or not, they're trying to hedge against potential future political changes against neoliberalism. So they freeze a political regime that's incredibly receptive to free market ideology in case a future politics becomes more progressive.
This is a very dangerous question, so I think each of us would be happy to now start speaking for a long while on this one. So
2 minutes.
So the answer on that is yes, definitely. I mean, basically this is exactly what it's all about. Any amount of politics can take place in the European Union and in the USA, but once you've put all of these policies into this overarching framework of long-term trade deals, that is a much bigger challenge. Government coming in cannot then derogate from the commitments made under those treaties. They are bigger than national law. And that's why when you hear people say, well, I'm going to make a really strong statement in the House of Commons that we will not abide by that. No, you won't. Well, you can. But they make absolutely no difference because you're trumped by these overarching treaties. And that's why it's so important. And that's why when you have all of the secret meetings in Bilderberg and the World Economic Forum and the Trilateral Commission and the Königswinter and all the ones people haven't even heard of, that's what they're going for. They're saying, let's forget the day-by-day, year-by-year running of things, and let's actually set up the future of our planet in the interest of big business.
What we can learn from that is that they are a hell of a lot better organised than we are most of the time, I think it's fair to say, because this stuff isn't happening by accident, and this isn't a one-off, as you suggest in your question, and as John has said. I mean, this is the culmination of decades of working to enshrine neoliberalism as the status quo, as the obvious thing, and that anything else is somehow deviant by suggesting there might be another way of organising the economy. And as I said, that hasn't happened by accident. It's happened in all of the kind of meetings John's been describing as a very specific intention and project of some very powerful people over time. Just to go back to the investor-state dispute settlement just for a moment, I've got a quote here from one of the rampantly pro-TTIP briefings from the lobby group, which talks about why it needs this dispute settlement system. And it says, some critics have suggested that investors should seek redress through the judicial system of the country where the investment is made, before asserting a claim in the investor-state arbitration. In other words, they're saying, why don't you use the normal courts of the normal countries before going to this special trade dispute system? And it goes on, such a requirement undermines the very reason why ISDS is included in most investment agreements, to depoliticize the issue in dispute, and to provide for a neutral panel to examine whether a host government has breached its treaty obligations. What it's actually saying there is that it doesn't trust the judicial systems, for example in the US or in EU countries, precisely because they might come under a bit more public scrutiny, and therefore, they might have to bear in mind other responsibilities and duties in terms of environmental regulation or social regulation or whatever. So what they're simply saying here is they want this completely removed from public scrutiny, from any kind of contextualization with all of the other concerns and responsibilities that governments have, and they just want it decided in purely corporate terms alone.
Just wanted to possibly some counterpoints with this. First point on business being profits and profits alone. I mean, what trade has always done, greater globalization has always done is actually increase competition, and the competition to the benefits end up with consumers' pockets. So, the tariffs are supposed to lower cost by reduction versus lower cost of average than the US by 4.5%. So, there are potential beneficiaries to this.
Can't hear the questions.
Sorry.
Stand up and speak.
And so on the negotiation stuff, on the secrecy issues, isn't it always the case that the negotiations are carried out by the Sherpas in backroom arrangements? I mean, in Greece we've seen that with the negotiations are carried out, then they go put these cases to the politicians say no, and then the Sherpas are reassembled and they have to come up with new proposals. I mean, so the suggestion seems to be that the democratic system is completely overruled. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, but
developing countries, which means we don't get sued as developed countries very often, but developing countries do get sued very often, and they've lost many times. So just in the last few months, Canada lost a case against a company that wanted to set up a quarry. It went to environmental review. The environmental review said it's a very bad idea to do this. The government said we're not doing it, and they got successfully sued by the company. And one of the points the company made and won on was that Canada shouldn't even have gone to environmental review. That was apparently against, whatever agreement it was signed up to. So that's one example. Canada's actually a really good example because it's been sued many times for environmental reasons. It tried to take a toxin out of petrol about 10 years ago. This was a NAFTA case, North American Free Trade Agreement, got successfully sued. And not only did it get sued, but it actually changed its policy on that. It changed it and put the toxin back in petrol. So there are examples not just of countries getting paid out, but of countries saying, actually, this is going to cost us so much money, we're going to we're going to change our policy on this. But there's been loads of other cases. So Argentina, just 2 months ago, was sued because during this economic crisis it told water companies that they couldn't raise the prices of water because people wouldn't be able to afford it. So it regulated and stabilised the price of water. Got sued, it now owes 400 million to some Western water companies. So there's many, many examples like this. And I think one of the things we're saying is, at the moment, we don't get sued that often because we don't have a load of American corporations who can sue us because we don't have that treaty in place. Under TTIP, tens of thousands of companies would be able to take this kind of action. And of course, our companies would be able to take this action against the United States as well.
The example I got written down here was the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Poland have between them been sued 127 times. And apparently the amount of money that they've been sued for would have been enough to pay for 300,000 nurses a year. I don't know in which country that would be the case. But anyway, it sounds pretty serious.
I'll make a question about whether trade is good for consumers and whether it makes prices cheaper and opens up competition. Actually, what we've seen as a result of the big trade deals of the past is you have a concentration. So what you end up doing is having the biggest companies getting more power over markets, buying out all of the other ones through these trade deals, and then actually they can hold the consumer hostage. So what's going to happen in agriculture is instead of having this plethora of small-scale producers across the whole of Europe, you're going to be in hock to some of the biggest agribusiness providers from the Midwest in the States. You can't compete if you're a small farmer in the Basque country. You can't compete with somebody in Missouri who's got, zillions of acres of corn and stuff. So that's the sort of thing that's going to come in, is a much more concentrated power. And the tariff stuff, already most of the tariffs between the European Union and the USA are at zero. There are a couple of areas where there's a little bit more still left over, but that's not what they're saying this is about. This is about the deregulation agenda. That's the official line on it. It's about looking at the regulatory barriers rather than the tariff barriers.
And it might be worth saying, John, I don't agree with the Cato Institute very often, very free market American think tank, but they're really worried about this. They don't agree with ISDS because they think it's effectively just a corporate subsidy, and even The Economist wrote an article saying, if you wanted to convince the public that this is a corporate conspiracy, you couldn't do any better than invent a system like this. But the Cato Institute say, very clearly, look, when it's about negotiating one tariff against another, there may be a case for secrecy. There is no case for secrecy when you're talking about big aspects of public policy like this. It's not democratic. So even on the free market, right, I think there's a real concern that this isn't really about the free market. It really is about the interests of very big capital.
I don't doubt that many people in this room are motivated by self-interest.
Sorry, can you speak up a bit?
I don't doubt that many people in this room are motivated by self-interest, but I do think it would be an interesting question to ask. There's a lot of talk about how TTIP could impact and possibly cause increased privatisation and affect things that are publicly funded. In that case, will this negatively affect publicly funded arts, and how?
Really clear. Who feels confident? John? Yeah.
And also, just to come back to Sam's point as well, just quickly on that one, who sits on the panels which adjudicate in these secret courts? Traditionally, it's been not judges or public figures, but corporate lawyers. And actually, sometimes it's been the same people who've been defending the same companies in previous cases. So sort of conflict of interest screams from the sidelines. System where instead of this obvious corruption, we're going to look for a better system where we have more of a roster of proper people who we can put up there and be sure that they will do it fairly, obviously in the interests of business, but they will be seen to be doing it fairly. So you've got to be careful a little bit to say it's bent because they've had all these people, because they're now saying, well, we're going to have a reformed, a better version, which is going to be squeaky clean. We're saying it ain't squeaky clean. They should just use the same courts as everybody else if they want to. On the cultural and the public funding side, it's very interesting that at the beginning of the negotiations, when the European heads of state were coming together and the heads of government were coming together and they were deciding what TTIP was going to look like from the European perspective, the French government said, we're happy with it, but we want our exception culturelle. We want to have a carve-out for audiovisual services, which has been an absolutely standard thing from the French side. We don't want to be swamped by Hollywood. We want to preserve the French language cinema, television, and therefore we will not let TTIP start unless you can give us this exemption. And the Germans said, bloody hell, and the English said, bloody hell, and the European Commission said, absolutely no way. And the French just said, it's up to you. If you want it to start, give us this. And if you don't want it to start, we can go away. And so they forced them to back down. The one sector which is exempted from TTIP is the audio-visual sector. Now, it's exempted for now, because the European Commission, grinding its teeth, went away and said, okay, but they still want to bring it back at the end and call the French government's bluff. But in terms of public funding for other cultural services, that's still in. And that's why in Germany, you've got the German Association of Cultural Services coming up and saying, culture is not a commodity. Culture is not something you can just buy and sell on the open market. And we say no to TTIP because in our sector, it's doing this, and we can see exactly the same principle happening across all the other sectors. So there is another reason for people around here to be very interested, and certainly for the readers of the stage to be particularly interested.
Question back to the time frame. If they succeed, the supporters of TTIP, with cutting out basically the democratic process and parliamentary process, what time frame are we talking about? What's the ideal world for them to get through with TTIP?
Great, so what's the time frame? We'll take a couple more questions. What was your question?
Is it not possible for normal legal courts to counter these companies for their environmental damage, etc.?
Super clear question. And there's one from Marion.
I was just going to ask, given that there's this problem in the case about the EU referendum and being in the EU, to what extent these issues can be used for...
Yes, you start on the EU, Karen.
Time frame and normal courts.
So Caroline, why don't you start on the EU?
Yes, so I'll take the final question first about how does it sit with the referendum on the EU. I mean, it sits very in a very complex and unhelpful way as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it depends obviously which side of the fence you are on whether or not you think on balance we have a better chance of achieving social and environmental positive outcomes by staying inside the EU or coming out. From my perspective, although having been an MEP for 10 years, I'm under no illusion about how undemocratic and untransparent the EU is. I'm under no illusion about how much reform it requires. Nonetheless, I still think there is a need for the EU, not least because so many of the challenges we face today, like the challenge of climate change or indeed some of the issues around human rights and social justice, in theory can better be pursued when you've got nations working together. So I'm coming from a point of wanting to reform the EU but to stay in it. Now the trouble is that's an awfully long number of words to put on a placard and march through the streets when you've just got Farage on the other side saying the EU stinks out. So it is difficult because it makes it more difficult for those of us who on balance want to argue to stay in the EU. You've suddenly got to deal with this. And we've got this, and actually we were talking earlier, all three of us actually, about what's happening with Greece. That's another bloody difficult thing that makes it hard to defend the EU. So I think that they will certainly be big issues in the referendum debate. I think it will have some implication in terms of how the different groups, both for and against the EU, line up. You know, I think the idea that there's going to be one big umbrella no group and one big umbrella yes group is less and less likely, because the very same reasons that I would want to stay in the EU are the very different reasons for why Cameron would want to. The kind of reforms David Cameron would love to see are the extreme opposite of the ones we would want to see. You know, we want to see a reduction in corporate power and a greater transparency. So I think what we will see is far more individual campaigns, Greens saying yes, or progressives for yes, or whatever the different things are. We know Labour, for example, are definitely going to run their own Labour Party yes campaign rather than being part of an overall umbrella. So I think we'll see a fragmentation, but I guess it'll be the same on the other side too, because those people who think on balance we do better outside the EU don't necessarily want to hitch their wagon to Nigel Farage. I can't think of the rest of my image, but you know what I mean. So there's going to be fragmentation, there's going to be a difficulty. I mean, what I'm worried about is that it's always easier to say a simple no than a yes but and yes we need to do this, this and this. And I think we're going to have to take some real advice from, hopefully, people who've got a lot of experience in how best to communicate complex messages to try to make sure we get this clear.
Absolutely. Even if you're outside, you will be as vulnerable, if not more vulnerable in this situation.
In terms of its impact, yes, we probably would be even more vulnerable. The only thing I guess we could say is that we have clean hands because we weren't part of it, but that's a high price to pay for actually having no voice around the table at all. And I think that's the case on so many of these issues that come up in terms of thinking that if we walked away from the EU, suddenly we would not be subject to the implications of what the EU does. We will be, but with even less voice, I would argue, than we have now.
So we're just going to quickly talk about time frame. Do you want to talk about it?
Time frame, essentially the negotiators wanted to have this done and dusted already. So the work we've already done means that it's nowhere near done and dusted. So that's great, we are winning and time is on our side in that sense. We hoped if Obama hadn't got his fast track it would be completely impossible before the end of his presidency. He has now got fast track, so we'll have to see how that plays out, but it would still be extremely difficult to get this through Congress as it stands at the moment. So we're really looking probably at the earliest 2017, having something in 2017. But just to add a little bit more detail on what Vivian was saying, because she's quite right, that this is one of 4 big deals. One is Canada-EU, it's called CETA. The C doesn't stand for Canada, but it's called CETA anyway. That has already been signed, and it is now awaiting ratification. We expected it to go to the European Parliament early next year. That may be delayed because they'll be worried that they can't get it through. But that's our most urgent priority because that does have ISDS and opens us up to a lot of these cases. There's been very little attention on it for various reasons. People think Canada's a nicer country than America, I suspect, is probably the reason there's not been more furore about it. There's also the Trans-Pacific that Vivian said. That's further along than TTIP. That's with Japan and some other Pacific countries, as it sounds like. It's further along, but still hasn't been signed. And there was a big campaign against it in America, where it's been compared to NAFTA. And NAFTA was such a toxic idea of a trade agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement, because the amount of jobs that were lost in America as a result of that agreement. And then the third one, as you said, is TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement. This is a very frightening agreement indeed. It's about liberalisation of services. It doesn't have an ISDS corporate core, but it does have in there, we believe, a standstill and a ratchet clause. And going back to what Anders says, effectively this sets the lower bar of, okay, where you are now, take a picture of that, and you're not allowed to go backwards in terms of liberalisation. So it would actually prevent governments unliberalising parts of their economy and ratchet up. If you take a move, it has to be towards more liberalisation. Very scary, and we haven't said enough about that either, but I think comes back to the idea, like Caroline said earlier, that this isn't one trade agreement that's just kind of happened by accident. It's a real plan for rewriting the rules of the global economy.
Very clear. So just the last question to be answered by John.
Which is on that one about whether or not you can counter-sue for your own domestic courts. Ecuador tried that. Ecuador was stung for a $2 billion suit from Occidental, the US oil corporation, which sadly was successful, so they were made to pay $2 billion. And they tried to fight back on a parallel thing through their own courts, where they said that Chevron had been guilty of a massive environmental and social destruction. And so they got a ruling in their own courts for $17 billion against Chevron, which you think, well, you're quid in, you can get the 17, pay off the 2, and it's all good. And of course, then it's a question of who's going to enforce this? Because Chevron have just said, we ain't paying. You know, you've just got your own court to say we're guilty. We're not paying that. And there's no way that the government of Ecuador can make Chevron pay. But the other way round, you can be made to pay. And that's another interesting case here from Slovakia. The new Slovak government came into power, and they said, right, we are going to reverse the privatisation of health that went before. Privatisation of health in Slovakia, hugely unpopular. In comes a government which says, our platform is to reverse that. All the people say, great, we're voting for you. They immediately get sued by a Dutch company which was doing very well out of the privatisation of health, made a lot of money out of it, and they said, you can't close down markets like that under the trade rules. The trade court, the ISDS court, says you're absolutely right, and says that the government of Slovakia have to pay this Dutch company 22 million euros. The Slovak government said, we're an elected government, we don't have to pay that. So a court in Luxembourg freezes 29 million euros of the assets of the Slovak people so that this Dutch company can be paid back. And now, what's interesting in the Russian case, which Nick referred to, $50 billion, the companies which have been given that award, because that award was made in their favour, saying you are going to be awarded $50 billion by the Russians, have started to ask for Britain, France, Belgium to start freezing assets of the Russian state around Europe. So it's just about power. And this is basically saying, we don't care about democracy. You know, democracy's old, boring. This is about non-stop, determined, guaranteed corporate profits for the future. And that's where we're going to fight it.